The autumn that year arrived like a verdict. The aspens did not burn gold the way they should have. They flared a desperate, feverish orange, and then fell. Overnight, the forest became a skeleton. The squirrels moved with a frantic, almost frenzied purpose, their cheeks swollen, their movements sharp and urgent, as though they understood something the people in the settlement below them had not yet begun to consider. The old-timers in Coldwater Ridge felt it in their joints, in the particular ache that settled deep in the knees when pressure changed. They looked at the sky and said nothing, because the people who said nothing were the ones who had been right before, and learned that being right early is indistinguishable, to most ears, from being wrong. Something was coming, something that did not have a gentle name. But before the snow came, before the cold that would change everything, there was a woman standing alone at her gate. Her name was Elara. She was 28 years old, and she was about to lose everything she had left. Picture a man on a horse at dusk. A big man. The kind of man whose shadow stretches long and dark across frozen ground. A man who has never once been told the word no and believed it would stick. That was Harlan Dredd. Town elder, land agent. The final word on all matters in Coldwater Ridge. He arrived at the edge of Elara's property with 2 of his men flanking him like bookends, and he did not bother to dismount. He did not need to. He read the decree in a flat, unhurried voice, the voice of a man who has rehearsed authority so long it has become his natural register. The township council had voted. The land was forfeit. The property, deemed unproductive and a burden to the settlement, would be reclaimed. She had until the end of the week. Elara stood at her gate and listened without moving. The cold air turned her breath to small white clouds that drifted and disappeared. Her lips were pressed together. Her hands were still at her sides. When he finished, Harlan looked down at her from the height of his horse and said the words that would ring in her ears for a long time after. "When the first snow buries you," he said, "it will be a mercy, because pride is a cold bed to die in." He turned his horse. His men followed, and the silence they left behind was enormous. One by one, across the lane, the curtains in the neighboring windows fell back into place. A door that had been cracked open swung shut with a soft, final click. No one came out. No one called her name. The world of Coldwater Ridge simply looked away. Elara did not weep that evening. She lit a single tallow candle and sat with her grandmother's journal open across her knees. A worn leather book, its pages dense with careful drawings of roots and bark and the undersides of leaves, the handwriting small and precise, and full of a love for things that grew slowly in the dark. Her grandmother had been a woman of unusual knowledge, not the kind the town respected, not the kind that came with a title or a deed or a seat at a council table, the kind that came from decades of watching, of listening, of learning to read the language the earth spoke quietly to those who were patient enough to hear it. Elara had grown up inside that language. She had learned it the way other children learned prayers, by repetition, by example, by the feeling of something becoming part of you before you were old enough to understand what it was. She turned the fragile pages carefully. She was looking for something specific. A passage she half remembered from years ago, something her grandmother had told her on a winter evening when the fire was low and the wind was high. Something about the deep forest, about a place that stayed warm when the world turned to ice. She found it near the middle of the journal, in a section marked simply, "What the Forest Keeps." The entry described an ironwood tree, an ancient one, the kind the loggers left alone because the wood was too dense and too twisted to be worth the trouble. In the final years of its long life, the heartwood of such a tree could begin to hollow naturally. And under the right conditions, that hollow became host to something remarkable, a thermogenic fungus, her grandmother called it, mycena, a living organism that generated its own heat as it broke down the wood from the inside, slowly, steadily, silently, in the patient way of things that do not need to be witnessed to continue. It is not a fire, her grandmother had written. It consumes without flame. The tree becomes a womb in winter, not dead timber, living breath. There were instructions, which trees to look for, how to identify them, how to prepare the hollow and encourage the bloom, how to build a door and leave ventilation channels so the warmth could circulate without pooling. Ilara read it twice. Then she closed the journal and sat very still in the candlelight for a long time. She did not know, in that moment, what was buried beneath the roots of that tree. She did not know about the tin box. She did not know about the letter inside it. She did not know that the words written on that letter would rewrite everything she believed about how her father had died, or who had let him. She would not know any of that for a long time yet. The next morning, she was not alone. Old Cutter, the trapper who lived on the eastern edge of the settlement, the only man in Coldwater Ridge who had ever spoken to her with simple, uncomplicated kindness, had been sick for several weeks. Everyone in town knew it. Everyone had watched his lamp burn lower and lower in the window as autumn deepened. That morning, his lamp went out. Ilara learned of it before noon. She went to the small cabin and found the boy sitting on the front step in the cold. 8 years old. A thin, serious face under a wool cap pulled down past his ears. He had his father's eyes, steady and quiet, the kind of eyes that had already seen more than they should have. His name was Callum. He had no one. Ilara stood at the bottom of the step and looked at the boy. She looked at the road leading into the forest. She looked at her hands. Empty, both of them. No land, no shelter, no plan that any reasonable person would call a plan. She thought about what her grandmother would have done. Then she picked up the small bundle of Callum's belongings from beside the step, held out her other hand to the boy, and said, "Come with me." Callum looked up at her. He did not ask where they were going. He simply took her hand and stood. They walked into the forest as the first pale clouds of the coming season began to stack themselves on the northern horizon, slow and enormous and absolutely certain. They walked for a long time. Callum did not complain. He watched the forest the way children do when they are trying to be brave, taking in every detail as though understanding the landscape might protect them inside it. Ilara walked with her grandmother's journal tucked against her chest and her eyes moving across the trunks around her, reading them the way another woman might read a letter. She was looking for lichen, the right lichen, silver green, growing only in the presence of something deeper. She found it in the late afternoon. The tree was enormous, ancient. Its trunk was wider than a cabin wall, its bark ridged and dark and layered like the hide of something that had been alive since before the town existed. On its southern face, nestled between two great roots that curved into the earth like sleeping arms, was an opening. A natural hollow, tall enough to stand in, dark and quiet inside, and the lichen was there. glowing faintly in the failing light, silver green and alive. Ilara placed her palm flat against the bark. It was warm, not sun-warmed, not surface-warmed, warm from the inside, the way a living thing is warm. She felt something release in her chest, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the night before. She kept her hand on the bark for a long moment, just breathing. Callum stood beside her, looking up at the tree with wide, careful eyes. "Can we really live here?" he asked. Ilara looked at the hollow, at the lichen, at the faint, impossible warmth radiating through the wood under her palm. "My grandmother taught me," she said quietly. "The earth never lies." Callum considered this. Then he nodded once, the way his father used to nod, like a man accepting the weight of a true thing. And somewhere beneath their feet, beneath the vast roots of that ancient tree, a tin box sat in the frozen earth, patient, waiting. It had been waiting for a long time. The work began before the sun was fully up. Ilara rose in the gray hour before dawn, when the forest was still and the cold pressed against everything like a hand. She had slept badly, not from fear, but from the kind of restless energy that comes when a mind refuses to stop working. She had lain on a bed of pine boughs inside the hollow, Callum curled against her side, and spent the long dark hours replanning every step. By the time the first pale light filtered through the trees, she was already outside with her grandmother's journal open across one knee, tracing the diagrams with a careful finger. The hollow was larger than it had appeared from outside. Once she had cleared the first layers of debris, centuries of fallen leaves, rotted wood soft as bread, the skeletal remains of small creatures that had used the space before her. The true dimensions revealed themselves. It was roughly oval, perhaps 12 feet at its widest, with walls of dense, living hardwood that curved inward at the top, like the ribs of something breathing. The floor was uneven but solid. The ceiling, where the hollow tapered, was high enough for her to stand without stooping. It smelled of earth and time and something else, something faintly sweet, faintly mineral, like rain on hot stone. The smell of the fungus. Even before it bloomed fully, it was already present, already alive in the wood. She worked methodically. Her grandmother's instructions were precise, and she followed them the way a musician follows a score, not mechanically, but with interpretation, with attention to what the material itself was telling her. She did not clear the entire interior. That was the first and most important rule. She cleared only the debris, leaving intact the sections of inner wood where the mycelium had already established itself. Those pale, thread-fine networks visible in the softer grain, delicate as frost on glass. She sculpted around them. She worked with a small hand axe and a short-handled shovel, moving carefully, always watching the wood. When she found a section dense with the white threads, she stopped, marked it in her mind, worked around it. Callum watched from the entrance for a while, then began hauling the debris out in armloads, carrying it to a spot 20 feet away and piling it neatly without being asked. He was a quiet worker, efficient. He did not fill the silence with questions. By midday, they had cleared enough space to stand side by side inside the hollow. By late afternoon, Ilara had begun the ventilation channels. Small curved passages carved near the top of the interior walls, angled in a gentle arc according to the diagram in the journal. The goal was convection, warm air rising, circulating, never stagnating. The fungus needed oxygen. The space needed to breathe. If the channels were wrong, the warmth would pool and then die. She carved them slowly. She checked the angle 3 times. On the 3rd day, she began cultivating the bloom. This was the step her grandmother had described with the most care, and with a kind of reverence that Alara had always found both beautiful and slightly unnerving in a woman otherwise so precise. This part, the journal said, is not engineering. It is tending. You are not building a fire. You are waking something that is already alive. She found the fallen ironwood branches her grandmother had described, older ones, their undersides coated with a fine powder that caught the light at certain angles, shimmering faintly like the inside of a shell. She gathered them into her canvas sack with careful hands, the way you gather something you are not entirely sure you have permission to take. Back at the hollow, she mixed the spore dust with water from the nearby stream and a handful of clay from its bank, working them together on a flat stone until she had a thick, even paste. Then she knelt inside the hollow and began to apply it to the inner walls with her bare hands. Behind her, without her noticing, Callum had fallen asleep, sitting up, his back against the bark, his chin on his chest. Copper was beside him, also asleep, the two of them leaning slightly into each other like bookends that had shifted over time. She looked at them for a moment, the boy and the dog, both improbable, both here, and felt something settle in her that had not been settled since the night at the gate. Then she turned back to the walls. It was slow work, deliberate. Her palms moved in long, smooth strokes across the curved wood, pressing the paste into the grain, into the channels where the mycelium threads already ran. The wood was cool, but not cold. Beneath her hands it felt almost, not warm, not yet, but receptive, as though it understood what she was doing. She worked until the light failed. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had made of the walls. They glistened faintly in the last gray light. The paste had disappeared into the wood. You could not see it anymore. You could only trust that it was there. "Will it work?" Callum asked, awake now, watching her from across the hollow. Ilara wiped her hands on her skirt. "We'll know in a few days." "What if it doesn't?" She looked at him across the dim space. His face was serious. He was not asking out of fear. He was asking because he wanted to understand the actual odds. He had his father's pragmatism, along with his father's eyes. "Then we find another way," she said, "but it will work." She said it with a certainty she was still building from the inside out. She had not planned to stay. That was the truth she rarely admitted, even to herself. When she had walked into the forest with Callum's hand in hers and nothing else, she had not had a plan so much as a direction. Away from the gate, away from the settlement, towards something her grandmother had written down 40 years ago in a book nobody had thought to look at. Plans, she had learned, were things you made when you had enough certainty to warrant them. She had not had certainty. She had had the journal and the lichen and the warmth under her palm, and that had been enough to take the next step, and then the next one. The work itself was changing her in ways she had not anticipated. Her hands, which had been soft from years of small domestic labor, were becoming something else, calloused, precise, capable in ways they had not been before. She could feel the difference when she pressed them against the bark at the end of a day's work, when the warmth came through the wood and into her changed palms. She had earned the ability to feel that warmth. That mattered to her. Callum noticed the change too, though he said things sideways, the way children do when they are observing something they are not sure they have permission to name. He said, "You look different than you did when we left." She asked him how. He thought about it for a long moment. "Like you know where you are," he said. She did know where she was. For the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she was. On the fourth day, they had their first visitors. Not the kind they wanted. Two men from town came out to the edge of the old-growth forest on some errand of curiosity or surveillance. They found Ilara on her knees outside the hollow, weaving a door frame from green saplings, and they stood at a distance and watched with the particular expression of men who have found something they find simultaneously ridiculous and satisfying. One of them called out, something about badgers, something about a woman who had chosen to live like one. Ilara did not look up from her work. They stayed for a few minutes, talking to each other in voices just loud enough to be heard, and then left. Their laughter moved through the trees long after they disappeared. Callum stood very still until the sound faded. Then he said, in a voice carefully drained of emotion, "They'll tell everyone." "Yes," Ilara said. "Is that bad?" She pulled the next sapling into position and pressed it into place. "It means we work faster." By that evening, the story of what she was doing had already made its way back to the center of Coldwater Ridge. She knew this the way you know weather, not because anyone told her, but because she could feel it. The air of the town had changed. She was a joke now. The best kind. The kind that tells itself. The betting pool had started within the week. She learned about it from Callum, who had overheard it outside the general store, and reported it back to her with the careful neutrality of someone who is angry but does not want to make the other person feel worse. The men of Coldwater Ridge had begun wagering on the date she would give up. The numbers ranged from 2 weeks to the first hard frost. Nobody had bet on spring. She had thought about this for a while, sitting with a journal open across her knees that evening. Then she thought about all the things that had existed before anyone thought to bet on them. The trees, the mycena, the slow, unremarkable accumulation of decades of observation in a leather-bound book that nobody in this settlement had ever thought to look at. Nobody had bet on her grandmother either. Her grandmother had simply continued, which was, in Ilara's experience, the most devastating response to being underestimated. She closed the journal and went back to work. Harlan Dread came on a morning that was bright and mercilessly cold, riding out through the old growth on his big gray horse with the self-conscious dignity of a man performing something he considers historic. He dismounted this time. That was new. He walked around the base of the ironwood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, examining her work with the studied expression of a man who wants to make his contempt feel like concern. He looked at the woven door, now reinforced with strips of hide. He looked at the ventilation channels. He looked at the carefully packed clay she had used to seal the gaps between door and bark. Then he turned and looked at Ilara. She was standing 10 feet away, not moving, not speaking. Callum was beside her, Copper, who had arrived 2 days ago, and she would get to that, sat at her left heel, watching Harlan with amber eyes and a stillness that was somehow more unsettling than a growl. "So," Harlan said, "this is it." He looked at the tree, shook his head slowly. "A home fit for a badger, or a fool." His expression shifted into something that might have passed for sorrow if his eyes had contained any. "I almost pity you, girl. To choose this?" He gestured at the hollow, at the packed clay, at the careful work of her hands. Over a warm bed in the poorhouse. It will be warm, Ilara said. 3 words. Quiet. No elaboration. Harlan stared at her. Then he let out a laugh that moved through the cold air like a thrown stone. Warm. He said the word back to her as though it were the punchline to a very old joke. Child, you will be a block of ice before the first full moon. And when your foolishness has run its course, he turned back to his horse and gathered the reins. I will have this monstrosity cut down and burned in a proper stove. And that will be the warmest you'll ever be. Mark my words, he said, looking down at her one last time. Nature is a beast to be broken, not a cradle to be rocked in. He rode away through the trees. The sound of hooves on frozen ground faded, and then there was only the wind and the sound of her own breathing. Callum looked up at her. He's wrong, he said, not as a question. Yes, Ilara said. How do you know? She put her hand against the bark of the ironwood. Even now, even before the fungus had fully bloomed, she could feel it. That faint, impossible warmth radiating from somewhere deep inside the wood. Because the tree told me, she said, and she meant it exactly as literally as it sounded. Copper had arrived the way most things that matter arrive, unannounced at an inconvenient moment when there was no reasonable capacity to take on anything more. Callum had found him on the second morning before the light was good. A large dog, some rough mixture of breeds that had settled into something dignified and serious, lying at the edge of the frozen dump at the settlement's eastern border. His ribs showed through lank, copper-colored fur. His eyes, when they opened, were amber and steady and entirely without self-pity. Callum had come back to the hollow and said, with the careful neutrality of a child who knows the answer might be no. There's a dog. Ilara had 1,000 reasons to say no. They barely had food. They barely had space. A dog was weight, noise, consumption, complication. She had said, bring him. Perhaps it was the pragmatism. A large dog was a guardian, a warning system, a source of warmth at night. Perhaps it was something else. Perhaps she recognized in the way the animal looked at her when Callum led him back, something she understood very well. The look of a creature that has been discarded and is not sure yet whether the world intends to be done with it. Callum named him Copper for the color of his coat. He fed him from his own bowl that first evening, carefully, making sure the portions were even. The dog ate without hurry, then lay down near the entrance and exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry every difficult thing with it. That night, when Callum woke from a bad dream, the kind that visited him still, the kind that had his father's face in them, Copper was already there. He had moved without a sound and was lying beside the boy with his chin on Callum's ribs, his amber eyes open in the dark. Callum put his arm around the dog and did not say anything. After a while, the shaking stopped. The days took on a shape. Ilara worked. Callum worked beside her. Copper kept watch. 3 days after she had applied the spore paste to the walls, the first faint traces of bioluminescence appeared. Tiny, barely there. A suggestion of blue-green light in the deep grain of the wood, pulsing so slowly it was almost impossible to distinguish from stillness. She pressed her hand to the wall and felt the warmth building there. Gentle, even constant. Not like fire, which spikes and dips and demands constant attention. Like something breathing. Like something patient. She lined the floor with dried moss and layered pine boughs over that. Then a piece of canvas, Then 2 wool blankets traded for at considerable cost. She built the door more solidly, sealing its edges with a mix of clay and dried grass that hardened to something almost like mortar in the cold. She made pegs from carved branches and hung their few belongings from them. She found a flat-topped rock outside the entrance that worked as a surface for preparing food. It was not a cabin. It was not a house. But it was beginning, slowly and with effort, to become something she did not have a precise word for. Something that had a center of gravity. Something you could return to. One afternoon, Callum came back from the stream with a piece of flat gray slate tucked under his arm. He set it in the corner with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something important. Ilara watched him. "What's that for?" He looked at it, then at her. "For my lessons." She stood very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the wall she was sealing, pressing the clay mix into a gap with her thumb, and she did not let him see her face. Because the feeling that moved through her in that moment, looking at an 8-year-old boy who had lost everything and was thinking about his education, was not something she had a name for. It was too large and too specific and too sharp for any word she knew. She just kept working, and she was grateful for the cold air on her face. Nora came for the first time on a Tuesday. Ilara only knew it was Tuesday because Callum was keeping count on his slate. She came quietly, the way certain women move through the world when they have learned that making themselves small is a form of safety. She left a cloth-covered basket at the base of the ironwood's roots and was gone before Ilara had fully registered her presence. Inside the basket, a small loaf of dense bread, 2 potatoes, a twist of paper containing salt, and a handful of dried beans. No note, no explanation. She came again 3 days later, then again 3 days after that. Always quiet, always gone before there was time to speak. Always leaving something that was exactly what they needed most in that moment, as though she had some reliable information about the state of their supplies. Ilara never found out how Nora knew. She suspected the woman simply paid more attention to the world around her than most people thought was worthwhile. Soren came once. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of quietness that comes not from shyness, but from a settled relationship with silence. He had been the settlement's blacksmith for years, Norwegian by birth, American by long habit. He saw Ilara splitting wood outside the hollow and stood for a moment watching her technique with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he walked over and, without asking permission, adjusted the angle of her axe grip with 2 fingers. "Wrong angle," he said. "Like this. You'll work half as hard for twice the result." He showed her once. Then he stepped back and walked away through the trees without looking back. She stood there with the axe in the corrected grip and swung it. The log split cleanly down the center with a sound like a sentence completed. The first crisis arrived quietly, the way the worst things do. Over the course of 3 days, she would later look back on as the hardest of the entire winter, not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most private. There was no audience for what she went through in those 3 days. Only Callum, only copper, only the hollow and the cold and the growing, gnawing fear that she had miscalculated in some fundamental way. It started with the food running out, not running low, running out. The last of the cornmeal went into a thin porridge one night. She divided it into 2 bowls and told Callum she had already eaten. He looked at her with those steady, too old eyes, and she held his gaze without flinching. He ate, He didn't press. The second day, she set snares along the stream, 4 of them placed the way her grandmother had described, at the intersections of animal trails she had been quietly mapping since they arrived. She came back in the evening to find them empty. The third day, Callum woke with a fever. It came on fast, the way fevers do in children, going from nothing to alarming in the space of a few hours. By midday, his forehead was hot to the touch, and his eyes had the glassy, slightly absent quality of someone listening to something no one else could hear. She sat beside him and tried to remember everything her grandmother had written about fever in the cold. She remembered most of it. She made a compress from a strip torn from her own underskirt, soaked in stream water, and laid across his forehead. She kept the hollow as warm as she could manage. She talked to him, not about anything important, just the sound of a voice, steady and present, something to anchor him while his body did its difficult work. She had 3 matches left in the box she'd been rationing since the first week. She used one to start the fire she'd built carefully at the entrance of the hollow, positioned so the smoke drew outward. The flame caught. She held her hands over it and felt the warmth reach through her palms. That night, around midnight, the snares. She checked them in the dark with Copper beside her, navigating by the blue-white light of a cold moon. The second snare held a rabbit, a large one, still and heavy in her hands. She said something under her breath that was not quite a prayer and not quite a thank you, and carried it back through the trees. By morning, Callum's fever had broken. He woke hungry. She had broth ready. He sat up and accepted the bowl with both hands and drank it with his eyes closed, and the relief that moved through Ilara's body was so profound it was almost indistinguishable from exhaustion. He looked up at her over the rim of the bowl. "You didn't sleep." "I slept a little." He looked at her steadily. He didn't believe her, but he didn't argue. He just finished the broth and lay back down and said, "Thank you." And she said, "Your father chose right, Callum. He left you with someone too stubborn to quit." It was the evening after the fever broke that the man from the township came with the paper. He was a pinched, officious sort, the kind of man whose entire sense of self resided in his capacity to deliver bad news with bureaucratic authority. He read from a folded document in a careful, deliberate voice. The forest surrounding the settlement, the old-growth timberlands, was designated as public land by decree of the Township Council, not to be occupied or altered by private individuals without explicit permission. Ilara was, the document stated with the particular cruelty of formal language, in violation. If she did not vacate by the end of the week, the matter of the boy, Callum, identified as a ward without formal guardianship, would be referred to the county. The county had a place for children without family. It was, the man said, for the child's own welfare. He finished reading. He folded the document. He looked at her as though expecting either a protest or a collapse. She gave him neither. She said, "Thank you for making the walk." He blinked, then he left. Copper watched him go. Did not growl, did not move. Just watched, amber eyes steady, until the man's footsteps faded to nothing in the frozen leaves. That night was the hardest night. Callum slept, still recovering, deeply under. Copper was at his side. The hollow was warm, the fungal light a slow, breathing blue-green on the walls, and it should have felt like safety. But Ilara sat outside the entrance with her grandmother's journal on her knees, and she could not make herself go in. She sat in the cold, And she thought. She thought about the county, about what a county home looked like for a boy of 8 who had already lost one life. She thought about Callum's face when he was asleep, unguarded, younger looking, the 8 years sitting on him fully without the careful composure he wore during the day. She thought about what it would mean to go back, to walk into the poorhouse with her head down, to say, "You were right, I couldn't do it." Take the warm room and the thin soup and the bed in the corner and let the boy stay safe beside her. She could do that. It was not impossible. It would be a kind of survival. Her hands were in her lap, still. The journal sat unopened, and then Copper's nose appeared at the entrance to the hollow. Just his nose, then his broad copper-colored head, and then the rest of him, moving silently until he had placed himself beside her on the frozen ground, warm and solid and impossibly calm. He didn't look at her, just sat, facing the same direction she was facing, as though whatever she was looking at was worth watching. She put her hand on his back. From inside the hollow, Callum's voice came, blurred with sleep, half-conscious. "Ilara, are you still there?" She closed her eyes for one moment. Then she opened them. "Yes, Callum," she said. "I'm still here." A pause. Then the sound of him settling back into sleep. She sat with her hand on Copper's back for a long time. The cold pressed in from all sides. The tree rose behind her, enormous and ancient and warm. She was not going anywhere. 3 days later, Alcott arrived. He came on a mule, which suited him. A small, spare man with a careful face and the kind of steady, watchful eyes that belonged to someone who had spent years reading documents that people didn't want read. A traveling attorney passing through Coldwater Ridge on his circuit. He had heard about her situation, he said, from a woman in town whose name he didn't give. He had some information she might find useful. Her father, he told her, had prepared a last will and testament before his death. Ilara knew this. She had assumed it had been lost in the confusion after his passing. The fever, the burial, the swift dissolution of everything he had owned. Alcott shook his head. It had not been lost. He had been, over the past several years, tracing its absence. And what he had found, what he was not yet ready to put into formal language, but what the evidence suggested, was that the document had not been misplaced. It had been kept. By whom and why, and what it contained. These were things he was still working to confirm. He would need time. He would come back. He looked at the hollow, at the faint warmth around the base of the great tree, at the careful, hard-won work of her hands. "You built this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted. The look of a man who has spent his life watching people be underestimated. He touched the brim of his hat and rode back toward the settlement. And in the quiet after he left, she felt the first thread of something she had not allowed herself to feel since the night at the gate. Not hope. Hope was too fragile, too light a word for what it was. Something older than hope. Something that lived in the wood of old trees and the patient turn of seasons. The certainty that the truth, given enough time, tends to find the surface. But what she did not know, not yet, was that inside the tin box buried beneath the roots of the ironwood, the truth had already been waiting for years, patient as the tree itself, and far more dangerous than she could imagine. The week Ilara lost all of them happened quietly, the way a rope frays. Not all at once, but strand by strand, until what remains is not enough to hold anything. Nora came for the last time on a gray morning. This time she didn't leave immediately. She stood with her back to the hollow for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, and Alara understood before a single word was spoken that something had changed. "My husband," Nora said without turning around. "He's been told it has to stop." She didn't say who told him. She didn't need to. There was only one man in Coldwater Ridge who told people what to stop doing. "I'm sorry," Nora said. Her voice was low and steady, the voice of a woman who has had long practice absorbing things she cannot change. "I'll leave what I can, when I can." Then she picked up her empty basket and walked back through the trees, and the particular shape of her quiet kindness walked with her and did not come back. 2 days later, Alcott sent word through an indirect channel. A boy from the settlement who appeared at the hollow with a folded note and was gone before Alara had finished reading it. The note was brief. Alcott had been approached by parties who had made clear that his continued presence in Coldwater Ridge was unwelcome. He would be moving on sooner than planned. He had not yet found what he was looking for. He had not given up. He would write when he could. He did not write. And then Soren. She heard about that one second-hand, Callum told her, having overheard 2 men talking near the general store. The township council had fined Soren a significant sum for what the official language called unlawful commerce with a person in violation of settlement ordinance. Unlawful commerce. The adjustment of an axe grip. A single word of practical advice in a cold forest. Callum recounted this with his face carefully neutral, the way he handled things he was angry about but didn't want to show. Ilara listened without expression. When he finished, she said, "Set those rabbits to soak. We'll eat well tonight." But that night, after Callum slept, she sat with her back against the warm wall of the hollow and felt the full weight of what the week had cost. Not in panic. She was past panic. In something more like stock-taking. The cold, clear accounting of a person trying to understand exactly what they have left to work with. She had the tree. She had the warmth building steadily in its walls, the fungal light now strong enough to read by on a dark evening. She had the journal. She had Callum. She had Copper. She had no allies in the settlement. No legal claim she could currently prove. And the winter, which had been gathering itself on the northern horizon for weeks with the patience of something that had no reason to hurry, was nearly ready to arrive. She was, in the most literal sense, on her own. She found it on a morning when the sky had the particular flat, white quality that comes just before everything changes. She had been working at the base of the ironwood's largest root, clearing debris that had accumulated over what appeared to be many decades. Compacted layers of leaves and soil and small stones. She was looking for drainage. Her shovel struck something solid about 8 inches down. She thought it was a stone. The sound was wrong for stone, a dull, flat resonance with a slight metallic quality. She set the shovel aside and used her hands. The box was small, perhaps a foot long, half as wide, made of tin that had darkened with age but held its shape entirely. It was wrapped in oilcloth, sealed over with what had once been wax. Someone had worked hard to make it resistant to the earth and the years. Someone had put it here deliberately. Ilara sat back on her heels and held it in both hands and felt the cold of it seeping through her gloves. Callum was at the stream. Copper was at her side, watching the box with polite curiosity. She carried it inside the hollow and set it on the flat-topped stone. She opened it carefully, peeling back the oilcloth, working the wax seal loose with her thumbnail. The tin lid was stiff, but gave. Inside, packed in a layer of dried lavender that still, improbably, retained a ghost of its scent, were two things: a small folded map, hand-drawn in pencil, the paper thickened and fragile, and a letter. The letter was in her grandmother's hand. She knew it before she fully read the salutation. She would have known that handwriting in complete darkness. She sat down on the floor of the hollow and read it in the blue-green light of the Mycena bloom. Her grandmother had written it in what must have been the final weeks of her life. The handwriting slightly less controlled than in the journal, the pen pressure uneven in places. But the mind behind it was entirely itself, clear, precise, unafraid. "The tree will know you when you find it," her grandmother had written. I say this not as poetry, but as fact. The ironwood chooses. It has always chosen. And if you are reading this, it has chosen you. Your father found this place before you. He came to understand what it was. Not just this tree, but all of them. The network, the full extent of what the old forest holds. He drew the map you'll find with this letter. 14 trees, each one capable of what you have already begun to build. He brought this knowledge to the man who calls himself the protector of your settlement. He offered it freely. He believed it could shelter the entire region, that no family would ever again lose a child to a winter that could have been endured. The man he brought it to did not want shelter. He wanted the land. When your father refused to sell, when he refused to sign over what was not his alone to sign, things were done. Papers were altered. A will that your father had written carefully and in good faith was placed in hands that had no intention of honoring it. What happened after that, I cannot prove. I can only tell you what I believe. And I believe that your father's death was not only a fever. Find the truth, not for anger. Anger will exhaust you and leave you empty. Find it because it belongs to you. Find it because the land belongs to you. And find it because 14 trees are waiting, and there are people in that settlement who will need every one of them before this winter is finished. The earth never lies. Neither did he. Neither should you. I love you beyond what any letter can carry. Go find the tree. Ilara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands for a long time, not moving. Copper put his head in her lap. Outside, the first flake of snow drifted past the entrance of the hollow. Then another. Then more. And within the hour, the world had gone white and still and silent in the way that means something that does not intend to stop. The signs had been building for days. Copper had begun pacing, not continuously, but rising again and again, moving in and out of the hollow, stopping at certain points in the surrounding forest and lifting his head in a way that was not quite alert and not quite alarmed, but somewhere between the two. He would not take his usual long sleep in the afternoon. Callum had noticed. He watched the dog one evening and said, "He keeps looking at the sky." "Yes," Ilara said. "That means something." "Yes." Callum looked up through the trees at the sky, which was the color of an old bruise, a deep, unhealthy yellow-gray that seemed to press downward, as though the clouds themselves had weight. "It looks sick," he said, "like when you can tell someone is sick before they say anything." The warmth inside the hollow was steady and strong now. The Mycena bloom had reached its full expression over the past week, and the interior held an even, deep heat through the coldest nights. They would be safe. But the people in the settlement, with their uniform log cabins and their cast iron stoves and their carefully rationed cordwood, were a different matter entirely. What she had not expected was the loneliness of being right. She had expected the doors closing. She had expected the laughter at the town meeting and the Reverend's gentle rebuke. These things were painful, but not surprising. She had been preparing for them since the day she had stood at her gate and watched the curtains fall back into place. What she had not prepared for was the walk home after the meeting, through the beginning of the snow, with the certain knowledge pressing down on her that what was coming was going to be very bad, and that there was nothing more she could do to prevent it. She thought about something her grandmother had written near the end of one of the journal's entries. Not about botany or weather patterns, but about the difficulty of carrying knowledge that the world around you is not yet ready for. Her grandmother had written, "The knowledge does not belong to you alone. It belongs to the moment when it is finally needed. Your task is simply to hold it until that moment comes." The moment was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of the clouds, in the quality of the silence that had settled over the forest. All she had to do was hold on a little longer. She went to the town. She did not want to go. She understood, with a clarity born of experience, exactly what would happen. She went anyway, because not going was not something she could make herself do. She started at the edges of the settlement, at the houses she had the most reason to approach, the families with young children, the older residents who lived alone, the people she knew were already running low on wood. She knocked on doors that she knew might not open, and she spoke, when they did, in the plainest language she had. A storm was coming, not the usual winter cold. Something larger. The signs were specific. The second bird migration, the animal behavior, the particular quality of the sky and air, the barometric patterns her grandmother's journal described in careful detail. She had been watching for weeks. This was not ordinary. At most doors, she was listened to with the patient, slightly glazed expression people reserve for the predictably eccentric. At some, the door closed before she had finished. At the Reverend's house, she was told, not unkindly, that placing one's trust in mushrooms over prayer was the kind of reasoning that led, historically, to difficulty. She went to the town meeting. She waited until the discussion reached a natural pause, and then she spoke. She said everything clearly, precisely, with the journal open to the relevant pages. She explained what the signs meant and what they historically preceded, in language drawn from her grandmother's decades of careful observation. Harlan Dredd let her finish. That surprised her. She had expected the interruption earlier. When she was done, he looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The mole girl is afraid of her own shadow." The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was loud enough. She walked home through a snow that had begun to fall in earnest, soft and unhurried. Callum was waiting at the entrance of the hollow with Copper beside him, both of them watching her approach through the trees. She stopped a few yards away and looked back in the direction of the settlement. She could see, through the stripped branches, the faint glow of the settlement's windows. Warm-looking, safe-looking, the comfortable light of people who had decided, for now, that warmth was guaranteed. Callum said, "They didn't listen." No. Are we going to be okay? Yes, she said. A pause, then quietly. Will they? She looked at him. 8 years old. Too serious for 8. Already understanding something about the world that most adults spent their lives trying not to understand. That knowing the right thing and doing the right thing are not the same, and that the gap between them is where most of the suffering happens. She turned back toward the settlement one last time. The sky had gone from yellow-gray to an almost violet darkness, and the wind, which had been still for days, had begun to move. That's why we warned them, she said. The storm arrived at night. It did not build gradually the way ordinary winter weather does, growing from manageable to difficult by predictable degrees. It arrived the way certain things arrive in old stories, fully formed, enormous, completely itself. 1 hour the snow was falling steadily and the wind was cold but navigable. The next, the world outside the hollow ceased to have a discernible form. The sound was what struck her first. She had expected howling, but this was something that had no analog in the natural world she knew. It was as though the seams of the world were coming apart at the stitches, as though the air itself were being torn into pieces, and the pieces were crying out about it. The trees moved in ways trees should not move. She could hear them. Not the usual creaking and swaying, but a deep, structural protest, the sound of massive things being pushed past their designed tolerances. Somewhere in the middle distance, something gave way entirely. A crack, like the world being split with an axe. Then the prolonged crash of something enormous coming down. Inside the hollow, the temperature had not changed. This was the thing that still struck her, even now, the absolute consistency of it. Outside, the world was dissolving into cold and chaos. Inside, the air was warm and still, and smelled of earth and wood and something faintly sweet. The fungal light pulsed gently on the curved walls. The floor was warm underfoot. She was tending the small fire at the entrance when she heard it. A sound. From outside. Against all the noise of the storm. A knock. 3 times. Deliberate. Ilara stood. She crossed to the entrance and pulled back the hide covering and looked out, and the cold that came in was a physical force, not just temperature, but pressure, something that pushed against her with actual intent. Harlan Dredd stood at the entrance. He was not the man who had come out on a horse to read decrees and deliver predictions of her death. That man had been large and self-certain and wrapped in the authority of his own convictions. This man was gray, not just his hair, his skin, his lips, the area around his eyes. He was dressed for a cold night, not for this. His coat was good wool, but it was not enough. His hands, when she looked at them, were the wrong color entirely. Behind him, barely visible in the lantern light, his wife held a small bundled shape against her chest. The shape was breathing in a way Ilara could hear from the entrance, quick and shallow and labored, like a machine running at the wrong speed. Their son, Eli, 5 years old, and not well. Harlan looked at her. That was all. He did not speak. He did not ask. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The expression of someone who has run completely out of everything else. She stepped back from the entrance. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." 2 words, no triumph in them, no qualifier, no reference to anything that had come before. Just the words themselves, plain and direct and meaning exactly what they said. He came in. His wife followed. Ilara took the boy from the wife's arms and carried him to the warmest section of the hollow. the wall where the mycena bloom was thickest, where the heat radiated most steadily, and laid him down on the furs. She put her hand to his forehead. She put her ear to his chest. His breathing was wrong, but he was breathing, and the hollow was warm, and the warmth, given time, had a way of convincing the body to keep going. Copper moved without prompting to the boy's side and lay down close but not touching. A large warm presence, slow breathing, steady. The boy's hands, which had been clenched, opened slightly. Ilara straightened and turned back to the entrance, because the knock came again, and again, and again. They came one by one and in small groups, stumbling in from the dark with the particular incoherence of people who have spent the last hour realizing that everything they trusted to protect them has failed. The family whose roof had given way. The man who ran the general store, who had named her tree Ilara's Folly, who stood at the entrance with an expression of complete moral deflation and could not meet her eyes. The reverend, who arrived without the dignity his position usually furnished him. An older couple whose feet were the wrong color, leaning against each other in a way that was not affection, but necessity. A young woman with an infant. A man with a broken wrist, poorly wrapped, who had fallen somewhere in the dark. 19 people. By the time the last of them came through the entrance, the hollow was full in the way a vessel is full, right to its capacity, but holding. Each time she stepped back from the entrance, each time she said the same thing. Come in, get warm, nothing else, no accounting, no reckoning, not yet. At some point in the long middle of the night, when most people had settled into an exhausted sleep, Ilara sat at the entrance with her back against the warm bark and looked at the 19 people inside the tree she had built. The mycena light pulsed on the walls, warm and blue-green and steady as a heartbeat. She thought about the letter in the tin box, about 14 trees, about her father, who had brought his knowledge to this man and been answered with theft and silence and something she still could not name with certainty. She thought about Clem, old Clem, the one man in the settlement who had looked her in the eye and said simply, without reservation, "I believe you, child." He was old, and he lived alone at the eastern edge of the settlement, and his legs had not been reliable for the past year. She had gone to his door when she made her rounds. He had answered it, and he had listened, and he had nodded slowly. She had told him about the hollow. She had told him how to get there. And she had known, even as she told him, that the distance was probably too far, that the path was probably too difficult, that the time might come when his legs would not carry him far enough, no matter how clearly he knew the way. She pushed the thought away. She returned her attention to the 19 people in her care, to the fire, to the steady warmth of the tree at her back. Outside, the storm had not eased. It pressed down with the whole weight of winter, something that wanted to unmake things. Inside the hollow, the temperature held. She closed her eyes and leaned against the warm bark of the tree her grandmother had sent her to find. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, 19 people slept. The first hours inside the hollow were the hours of pure logistics. 19 people in a space built for 3 required a different kind of thinking. Not emotional, not reflective, just the clear-eyed management of limited resources against specific needs. Ilara moved through it the way her grandmother had taught her to move through difficult problems. Start with what is most urgent, then work outward. Warmth was not the problem. The mycena bloom held its temperature with a steadiness that continued to surprise her, not with spikes or fluctuations, but with a deep, even constancy, like the warmth of a living body from the inside. Even with 19 people breathing in the space, the air stayed clear. The ventilation channels she had carved so carefully, checking the angle 3 times, were doing exactly what her grandmother's journal had promised they would do. Food was the problem. She had supplies for 3 people across several days. Divided across 19, that became something much more modest, enough to take the edge off hunger, not enough to satisfy it. She divided everything she had with Callum's help, working quickly, portioning with the calm precision of someone who has already done the calculation and accepted the answer. She started with the children, then the elderly, then everyone else in order of visible distress. No one complained about the portions. No one asked for more. The people who had come through the storm were not the same people who had stood in the general store laughing at her 3 weeks ago. That version of them had been burned away somewhere between the moment their roofs gave way and the moment they crawled through the entrance of the hollow. What sat against the warm walls now was something more honest. People stripped of the social architecture they usually lived inside, left with just the bare fact of themselves, and a great deal of gratitude they didn't yet know how to express. Everett, the man from the general store, whose name she had always known and who had simply never used it in her presence, helped her organize the sleeping positions without being asked. He did it silently, moving people with a gentle efficiency, giving up his own spot near the warmest wall to an elderly woman who was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. He didn't look at Alara while he did it, but he did it. Eli, Harlan's youngest, was responding to the warmth, not quickly, not dramatically, but the shallow, labored quality of his breathing was evening out by degrees. Ilara checked him every half hour through the first part of the night, kneeling beside him in the mycena light, listening to his chest with the focused attention her grandmother had taught her. Each time she moved away from him, the knot in her chest loosened slightly. Harlan watched her do this. He said nothing, but he watched. Callum moved through the crowded space like someone who had been doing this his whole life. He was 8 years old and had, until several weeks ago, lived the ordinary life of a trapper's son at the edge of a small settlement. But something in the circumstances of the past weeks, the loss of his father, the weeks in the hollow, the daily practice of adapting and surviving and learning, had produced in him a quality she had no precise word for. Steadiness, maybe, or readiness. The capacity to meet whatever the present moment required without first consulting his feelings about it. He organized the other children. There were 4 of them, ranging from the 6-year-old girl whose family had arrived second to a boy of about 11 who was trying very hard to appear as though none of this was affecting him. Callum assessed the group with a brief, unsentimental look, and then sat down among them and began, with no particular ceremony, to talk. Not about the storm, not about the hollow, or Alara, or what had happened to bring everyone here. He talked about Copper, about the day he'd found him at the dump, how the dog had looked, how he had walked back to the hollow with Copper at his heel as though he'd always lived there. He talked about the rabbit snares and the trick of reading animal trails in snow. He talked about the way certain moss grew only on the north side of trees, and how you could use that to navigate in a forest when the sky was hidden. The children listened. The 11-year-old, who was trying not to be affected, was the most attentive of all of them, though he kept his face carefully composed. And Copper, who had been circulating through the space with his quiet, purposeful warmth, eventually came and settled in the center of the group of children and exhaled the long, satisfied sigh of a dog who has found his correct position. The 6-year-old girl, her name was Petra, Ilara would learn later, had not spoken since she arrived. Her parents had exchanged a look over her head when they came in, a brief and worried look that communicated something they hadn't put into words. The girl was present, but sealed. Her eyes moved. She responded to physical prompts, but the mechanism that connected her interior to her exterior seemed to have stopped working somewhere in the storm. She sat near Callum, but not quite with the group. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her arms were wrapped around them. Callum noticed. He did not make an event of it. He simply, at a natural pause in the conversation, picked up Copper's large, warm head from the floor and redirected it gently until the dog was lying with his chin across the girl's feet. The girl looked down. Copper looked up at her with his amber eyes. His tail moved once. The girl uncurled her arms from her knees with a slowness that was almost geological. She placed one hand, very carefully, on the top of Copper's head. The dog closed his eyes. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then, in a voice so quiet that Ilara, across the hollow, almost didn't hear it, "Is he cold?" Callum said, "No, he's warm. You can hold him tighter." The girl's arms came around the dog with a force that surprised them both. Arms that had been held so tight for so long, finally finding somewhere to go. She pressed her face into his fur. Her shoulders, which had been held rigid since she arrived, came down. Then she cried. Great, heaving sobs that had clearly been stored under enormous pressure for hours. She cried the way children cry when they have been brave for too long, and the bravery has finally run out. Copper did not move. He absorbed it with the perfect equanimity of an animal for whom emotional weight was no different than physical weight, simply something to be held. Every adult in the hollow found somewhere else to look, not from indifference, from the opposite of indifference, from the recognition that certain moments are private even when they happen in crowded spaces, and the most respectful thing you can do is look away and pretend not to be as affected as you are. Ilara looked at the wall. She pressed her lips together. She kept her breathing even. After a while, the sobbing quieted into hiccups, and then into the long, shuddering sighs that come after the worst of it is over. Petra's grip on Copper loosened. Her eyes, when she lifted her face from his fur, were red and swollen and entirely present. "What's his name?" she asked. "Copper," Callum said. She looked at the dog for another moment. "That's a good name," she said. Then she leaned back against the warm wall of the hollow and closed her eyes, and within a few minutes she was asleep, with her hand still resting on the dog's side. The 11-year-old boy had his head turned away. His jaw was working. Callum looked at him with the calm patience of someone who is going to give a person all the time they need. It was late, deep in the long middle of the night, that Harlan Dredd came and sat near her. He sat without asking permission, which was old habit. But the way he sat was different. Not the settled, proprietary ease of a man in his own territory, but the careful, deliberate positioning of someone who is not sure of his welcome, and is trying to take up as little space as possible. For a long time, he said nothing. They sat in the blue-green light and listened to the breathing of the people around them, to the storm outside, to the steady small sounds of the fire. Then he reached inside his coat. He took out a folded piece of paper. The folds were old, the kind that come from something being folded and unfolded many times over many years, the creases worn thin at the intersections. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then he set it down on the ground between them. Ilara looked at it. She did not touch it. She waited. "Your father," Harlan said. His voice was quiet. Something had gone out of it. The authority, the practiced resonance. What was left was just a voice, a tired man's voice. He came to me with what he'd found. The trees, the map, all of it. He stopped. He was trying to give it to the settlement. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wanted people to be safe. A pause. I had already made arrangements with a lumber concern from the east. The old growth was worth considerably more as timber than as shelter. The will he'd written left the land to you, which would have complicated things significantly. He did not use the word kept. He did not say, "I took it," or "I hid it," or "I let him die." He moved through the territory of what he had done with the careful, oblique language of a man who cannot yet bring himself to name it directly. But the shape of it was clear. She had it now. She looked at the paper between them. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. Her father's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, had been looking at it all her life in the margins of books and on the backs of receipts. Neat, slightly forward-leaning, the letters of a man who wrote quickly because he was always thinking faster than his hand could move. She read it. It said what Alcott had told her it would say. The land, the forest, all of it, to her. She folded it along its original creases. She set it inside her grandmother's journal between 2 pages and closed the journal. Harlan was looking at the Mycena light on the wall, that slow blue-green pulse that had no interest in what he had done or not done. I told myself I was building something, he said. Something that would last. Something the settlement needed. He glanced up. I was wrong about what the settlement needed. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in that night. I was wrong about a great many things. Ilara looked back at him. She thought about her father, about the 14 trees, about the knowledge that had been buried for years because this man had decided that his version of the future was the only one worth building. She thought about what it cost a man like Harlan to sit across from her in the hollow of the tree he had tried to have cut down and produce a document he had suppressed for years. She had known men like Harlan, men who confused confidence with correctness, who had never developed the internal machinery for being wrong because the world had never required it of them. The world had required it of him now. The machinery was grinding against itself, producing a version of accountability that was incomplete and partial and the best he was capable of tonight, in the blue-green light, surrounded by the people his certainty had endangered. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought about Clem. She decided that some questions did not have answers tonight. Some things you had to carry for a while before you knew what they weighed. She did not say any of this. There would be time for some of it later, in daylight, in the changed world that would exist after the storm. She simply closed the journal with the document inside it and set it against the wall beside her. That was all the answer she had to give him tonight. He seemed to understand this. He nodded once with a slow, heavy movement of a man accepting a verdict, and moved back to his wife's side and did not speak again. Soren had arrived in the first hour of the storm, carrying a canvas bag that contained several useful things: a coil of rope, a small hand axe, a cloth sack of dried oats that nearly doubled their food supply. He had set these things down without announcement and then positioned himself near the entrance of the hollow, and he had stayed there most of the night, not because he was cold. The hollow was warm and there was room near the walls. He stayed at the entrance because someone needed to, because the entrance was the most vulnerable point of the structure, because if something went wrong, that was where he would be most useful. He had not been asked to do this. He had assessed the situation and determined what was needed and placed himself there. Late in the night, when Alara sat down near the entrance to rest her legs, Callum appeared beside her. He looked at Soren, who was awake and watchful at the entrance with his back against the bark, his large hands quiet in his lap. Then Callum leaned slightly toward Alara and said, in the soft, matter-of-fact voice he used for observations he considered important, "He looks at you the way copper looks at the fire." Alara said nothing. Callum nodded once, as though this confirmed something he'd already decided, and went back to his pine bough bed. Across the hollow, Soren had not moved. He was looking at the entrance, but the corner of his mouth had shifted slightly, in a way that could have been the light. Alara looked at the warm wall of the hollow. Her ears were warm. She put both hands on her knees and focused on the sound of the storm and the breathing of the people in her care, and the steady, reliable pulse of the Mycena light on the curved walls. These were concrete things, real things. She was good at real things. The night inside the hollow had its own rhythm, different from any night she had spent in a building. Buildings have a way of pretending that the world outside is not happening. Thick walls, good doors, the architecture of refusal. The hollow made no such pretense. She could feel the storm through the wood, feel it the way you feel a river through your feet when you stand on a bridge. The vibration of something enormous and indifferent, moving through the structure she had built, testing it. The structure held. She found this more remarkable with every passing hour, not less. She had built it herself. She had made every decision. The angle of the ventilation channels, the thickness of the door, the depth of the clay seals, the placement of the fire at the entrance so that the smoke drew outward and the heat pushed inward. She had made each of these decisions based on instructions written in a notebook by a woman who had been dead for 15 years. And the decisions were right. They were all right. The hollow held because she had understood what she was building and had built it accurately. There was a specific kind of confidence that came from this. Not the loudness of Harlan's certainty, which she understood now had always been covering for something underneath. The other kind, the kind that does not need to declare itself because it has already been tested and has already held. She had it now. She would not lose it again. Sometime in the 4th hour, when the storm showed no signs of lessening, an old woman who had been sitting near the entrance asked to know what the blue-green light was. Alara told her. She kept it simple. The fungus, the thermogenic process, the principle of what it did, and why the tree had been chosen. She talked about her grandmother, about the journal, about the decades of quiet observation that had made this night possible. The old woman listened. She did not interrupt. When Alara finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I knew a woman like that once," the old woman said. "Everyone thought she was foolish for paying attention to things that didn't seem to matter." A pause. "She was always right." Alara looked at her. "What happened to her?" "She died," the old woman said simply. "The way everyone does, but what she knew didn't." She settled herself more comfortably against the warm wall and closed her eyes. Alara sat with that for a while. What she knew didn't. This was the thing, the true inheritance, the thing that the tin box and the map and the letter were all pointing toward. Not land, not vindication, not even justice, though justice mattered. The thing that lasted was the knowledge, when it was given away freely and received with care. Outside, the storm screamed on, indifferent to all of them. Inside, 19 people breathed in the warm air, and the Mycena light pulsed on the walls, and Alara sat at the entrance of the thing she had built and understood, fully and finally, what her grandmother had been trying to tell her. Callum's fever announced itself quietly, the way it always did, not with drama, but with the subtle wrongness that a careful observer catches before the obvious signs appear. She noticed it in his color first, then in the way he moved. A fraction slower than usual, a fraction less precise. She put her hand to his forehead at some point in the long middle of the night and felt what she had feared. She moved him to the warmest position in the hollow, the spot by the densest section of the bloom, and made him lie down, and covered him with the better of their 2 blankets. She brought water. She made a compress the way she'd made the last one, during his first fever weeks ago, and laid it across his forehead. He looked up at her. His eyes were glassy, but present. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said. "Rest anyway." He watched her for a moment with the steady, slightly too old gaze that always moved her in ways she didn't have words for. "You'll stay close?" "Yes," she said. "I'll stay close." He closed his eyes. His breathing evened into sleep relatively quickly. His body had learned to trust the hollow in the way that bodies learn to trust safe places. The surrender was faster than it would have been a month ago. She did not sleep. She sat beside him through the hours and watched the fever work and tended the compress and listened to the storm. She thought about her grandmother, about the journal, about a woman who had spent decades accumulating knowledge that no one in her community would credit, who had written it all down with meticulous care and buried it in an oilcloth-wrapped box under the roots of a tree, trusting that someone would come looking. She sang quietly, not enough to wake anyone, just enough to give the air in the hollow a shape beyond breathing. The song was one her grandmother had sung, and her grandmother's mother before that, a simple melody that had no story attached to it, only a feeling. The feeling of being held by something larger than yourself. The feeling of the earth at your back and the dark all around you, and still, somehow, enough warmth to survive it. Callum stirred once, near what she judged to be the deepest part of the night. He did not open his eyes. He said, blurred with sleep, "Ilara." "Still here," she said. He settled back. His breathing stayed even. The dawn came without announcement. There was no dramatic lightening of the sky, no clear signal that the worst had passed. The storm simply began, at some point in the gray early hours, to exhaust itself. The sound of it changed. from that sustained enormous pressure to something more intermittent, gusting and subsiding rather than constant. Then the gusts became less frequent. The silences between them grew. And in one of those silences, Callum's breathing changed. She had been monitoring it for hours. She knew the difference, by now, between the breathing of a child who is fighting a fever and the breathing of a child whose body has won. The change was subtle. A slightly longer exhale, a slight loosening in the chest. She put her hand to his forehead. The fever had broken. She stayed with her hand on his forehead for a long moment, feeling the heat that was no longer the wrong kind of heat. Just the ordinary warmth of a sleeping child in a warm place. Then, very quietly, so as not to wake anyone, she gathered her knees to her chest and pressed her face into them. The feeling that moved through her was not simple enough to be called relief, though relief was part of it. It was all of it at once. The weeks of it, the cold and the hunger and the fear and the work and the loneliness and the loss and the 19 people sleeping behind her and the document in the journal and the 14 trees on the map and Callum, alive, breathing, warm. All of it arriving at once in the space behind her sternum, too large for the container. Some burdens, when they finally lift, feel exactly like falling. She did not make a sound. She sat with her face in her knees until the feeling had moved through her and left her emptied and clean and very tired. And then she lifted her head and looked at the hollow. The Mycena light pulsed on the walls, slow, blue-green, steady. Outside, the storm had stopped. The silence it left behind was the largest silence she had ever heard, vast and white and full of the specific peace that only comes after a very long, very loud thing has finally finished. She put her hand flat against the warm bark. It was holding. It had held all night. It would hold for as long as it was needed, and then longer. The earth never lies. She stood up slowly and moved to the entrance and pushed the hide aside and stood in the opening. The world outside was unrecognizable and entirely itself, white, still. The trees stood in the gray morning light, bowed under their loads of snow, but standing, every one of them. In the sky's eastern quarter, just beginning to show, was the faint, rose-gold suggestion of the sun returning. Behind her, she heard Callum stir. Then his voice, rough with sleep, entirely himself. "Is it over?" She looked at the sky, at the snow, at the long blue shadows the trees cast in the early light, at the world on the other side of the worst night, still there, still standing. "Yes," she said. "It's over." A pause. What does it look like? She considered this for a moment. How to say it? What word was adequate? "Like the beginning of something," she said. The settlement looked like something that had been shaken and set down wrong. Roofs had given way. Fences had collapsed under the weight of snow that sat on everything now in deep, heavy accumulations, pressing down with a patience that wood and wire had not been able to match. Several outbuildings had folded entirely, not dramatically, just settled into themselves like something that had finally stopped trying. The great iron stoves, which had been the pride and the promise of Coldwater Ridge, sat cold in the cabins where the wood had run out sometime in the long middle of the night. 19 people walked out of the forest that morning in a loose, quiet procession. They walked through the white stillness of the aftermath with the particular gait of people who are not yet sure their legs remember how to move in a world that isn't fighting them. The children were subdued. The adults said very little. Elara walked at the back. She watched them go. The reverend, the storekeeper, the families who had come through her entrance with nothing left of the certainty they'd worn like clothing for years. She watched them walk back into the settlement they had built with iron and uniformity and the profound conviction that nature was an enemy to be defeated. And she thought about her grandmother's letter and the 14 trees and everything that was going to have to be different now. Harlan Dredd walked near the front and did not look back. She walked a longer way back, through the part of the settlement she knew best, past the houses she had knocked on when she went door to door with her warning, past the windows that had closed. She did not rush. The world was changed, and it deserved to be looked at. She heard about Clem from Nora, who told her quietly, on the morning after the storm, with the careful gentleness of someone who knows the information they are delivering has no soft version. He had been found in his chair. He was dressed in his good coat, the one he kept for Sundays and occasions, as though he had been preparing to go somewhere. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked, Nora said, entirely peaceful. Whether that was true, or simply what people said about such things, Elara could not know. She went to his house. She stood outside it for a long time in the snow, in the white morning quiet, and looked at the door and the window and the small covered porch where he had sat on warm evenings and called out to her, on the occasion she passed, without any of the wariness most of the settlement had extended to her. Just a simple acknowledgement, one person to another. I see you. I believe you. Good morning, child. He had believed her. He had known she was right about the storm, and he had known the distance was too far. And he had put on his good coat anyway, as though the intention could substitute for the capacity. She did not weep there, on the street, in front of his house. She stood, and she looked, and she let the full weight of it sit on her chest without trying to redistribute it into something more manageable. This was what it cost. Not just her own weeks of hunger and cold and loneliness, which she had chosen. This was the part that could not be chosen back into acceptability. A man had died who did not have to die, because a community had chosen comfortable certainty over inconvenient truth, and that was not something that any reckoning or apology or return document could unmake. She stood there until she had made her peace with carrying it. Then she walked home. The town meeting was held 3 days later, when the settlement had dug itself out sufficiently and the immediate needs of the damaged households had been addressed well enough that people could stand in one room and think about something other than survival. Alcott was there. He had come back, arriving the morning after the storm with the mud of the road still on his coat, saying only that he had heard, and that there were things that needed to be settled. He sat near the wall with a leather case on his knees, and the quiet, watchful expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment for a long time. The meeting began with the accounting of damage. It was significant. It was, for this particular settlement in this particular winter, the kind of significant that requires a reassessment of fundamental assumptions rather than just repairs. Then Harlan stood. He was not the same man who had stood at a table and spoken with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never been seriously wrong. He was grayer, smaller in some way that had nothing to do with physical size. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the assembled people of Coldwater Ridge and said what needed to be said. He said it plainly. He had made a series of decisions that had been wrong. He had prioritized his own interests, specifically a timber arrangement with a concern from the East, over the welfare of the settlement. He had, as part of this, suppressed a legal document that was not his to suppress. The last will and testament of a man who had tried to give this community something valuable and had been answered with obstruction. He reached into his coat. He took out nothing, because the document was no longer his to produce. He looked at Alara. She opened her grandmother's journal and took out the folded pages and walked to where Alcott sat. She handed them to him. Alcott opened the case on his knees. He had spent the past weeks verifying the document's authenticity and legal standing. The document itself was valid, and its meaning was clear. The land, the old-growth forest, all of it to Alara. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the Reverend said, in the voice of a man who has spent several days in private reckoning and has arrived at something difficult but necessary, "We owe this woman more than land." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The room understood what he meant. And the room sat with it in the uncomfortable, essential way that people sit with true things they would have preferred not to know. She found Harlan afterward, when the meeting had dispersed. He was standing at the edge of the settlement where the road leading east began, his horse saddled, his bags packed. He had not announced this. He had simply prepared. He turned when he heard her footsteps in the snow. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the horse. Then back at her. "I've done what I can do here," he said. It was not an excuse. It was, she thought, as close to accurate as he was currently capable of being. She looked at him, this man who had taken her land and suppressed her father's will and let a community spend a winter underprepared for what was coming because his plans required a particular version of their ignorance. She had thought, in the weeks leading up to this moment, about what she would say when it came. She had composed versions of it in her mind on long nights in the hollow. Some of them were satisfying in the way that fantasies of justice are satisfying. Precise and complete and devastating. She said none of them. "Then go," she said. 2 words. Not with the kindness she had offered at the entrance of the hollow during the storm. That had been for everyone, regardless of what they'd done, because the storm made everyone equal. This was different. This was with the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a weight for long enough that setting it down and watching it walk away is the only remaining mercy. Harlan looked at her for one more moment. Something moved in his face. Something complex and unfinished that would probably stay unfinished, because some things do not resolve cleanly. And the people who understand this best are the ones who have lived long enough to watch it happen. He mounted his horse and rode east, and did not look back. Alara watched until the road curved, and he was gone. Then she turned around and walked back toward the forest. What surprised her most about the aftermath was not the accounting or the legal proceedings, or even the Reverend's public statement of remorse, which was carefully worded and meant well, and was, in the end, a less honest thing than his simple silence in the hollow during the storm, when he had sat against the warm wall and looked at the blue-green light, with an expression that needed no words. What surprised her was how ordinary the changed world felt once it arrived. She had expected, what? A sense of completion, perhaps, A feeling of doors opening that corresponded to the doors that had closed. Instead, there was simply the next day, and the work that came with it, and Callum at the table with his legal text, and Copper at the entrance doing his morning assessment of the surrounding forest. The trees were still there. The mycena still bloomed. The journal still needed to be copied out in a cleaner hand so that the pages, fragile now, softened by years of handling, would not be lost. The second map needed to be verified against the actual locations of the trees, which meant walking each route and checking the landmarks and making corrections where the years had changed things. There was so much work still to do. She had once thought that vindication would feel like rest. She understood now that it felt nothing like rest. It felt like the moment when the path you've been struggling up finally levels out, and you can see how far you've come, and also how much farther there is to go, and the distance ahead no longer looks impossible because you have evidence now of what your legs can do. She picked up the journal and went back to work. Alcott came to the hollow 2 weeks after the storm with a folder of documents. He walked her through them with the methodical patience of a man who respects the intelligence of the person he is talking to. The land transfer was straightforward. The legal complications around the suppressed will were more involved, and there were things that might come of it and things that might not. And she should understand what was realistic. She understood. She had always been good at understanding what was realistic. He had one more thing. He reached into the folder and produced a piece of paper she recognized, the hand-drawn map she had found in the tin box, the one her father had made. 14 trees marked in pencil. "I'd like to understand this," Alcott said. So she told him about the mycena, about the thermogenic process, about what her grandmother had spent decades documenting and what her father had tried to give to the settlement before he was stopped, about what the hollow had done on the worst night of the winter. Alcott listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening. When she finished, he looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said, 14 trees. 14, she said. He nodded slowly. That's enough to shelter the surrounding region, not just this settlement, the entire area. Yes, she said. That's what my father understood. Alcott folded the map carefully and handed it back to her. I think, he said, that you should keep this. It was Callum who found it, 3 weeks after the storm, when they were repairing a section of the hollow's inner wall where the bark had cracked in the cold. He called to her from inside. She came, and he pointed without speaking. Behind the crack in the wood, visible only because he had been working at the gap with careful hands, was a small folded piece of paper, not in the tin box, not under the roots, hidden inside the wall of the tree itself, in a deliberate shallow cut in the heartwood, wrapped in a scrap of oilskin. She unfolded it carefully. It was a second map, in her father's handwriting, not her grandmother's, drawn later, the pencil darker, the lines more confident, and showing not just the 14 trees, but the paths between them, the routes that connected each hollow to the next, distances, landmarks, notes in the margins about which trees were readiest, which would take the most cultivation, which faced south and which needed adjusted ventilation. He had been back here, her father, after he found the first tree, after he tried to give the knowledge away and was refused. He had come back to this tree and hidden this map inside it, a second layer, a fail-safe. as though he had known, on some level, that the first attempt would not succeed and had prepared for the longer version of the plan. He left it inside the tree, Ilara said quietly. Callum looked at the map, then at her. He knew you'd find your way here. She stood with the map in her hands for a long time. Then she laid it on top of the first one, in the journal, beside her grandmother's letter, beside her father's will. 3 generations, all of it pointing the same direction. The teaching began in the early thaw, when the snow was retreating and the ground was muddy, and the forest was making the particular sounds of a world reassembling itself after a long suspension. She had not planned it formally. She had simply, one morning, found 3 people standing at the base of the ironwood when she came outside. The 11-year-old boy from the night of the storm, whose name was Birch. Everett from the general store, who had reorganized the sleeping positions in the hollow without being asked, and a woman named Sigrid, who had arrived in the settlement the previous autumn and had watched everything that happened with the attentive neutrality of someone who is still deciding what kind of place they've come to. They did not say why they were there. They waited. Ilara looked at them. Then she went inside and got her grandmother's journal. She taught them at the base of the tree, in the cold spring air, with the journal open across her knees. She started with the basics: how to read a forest, how to understand what you were looking at when you looked at the relationship between a tree and the organisms living in it. She moved from that to the specific, the ironwood, the mycena, the thermogenic process, the signs you looked for, the preparation required, the patience the whole thing demanded, the absolute non-negotiability of patience. Soren built a shelter over the teaching area without being asked, a simple lean-to of logs and thatch that kept the rain off. He worked without ceremony, selecting materials with the eye of someone who knows what he is doing, and the shelter that resulted was solid and would last. The hardest part of teaching was not the knowledge itself. The knowledge was in the journal, laid out with her grandmother's characteristic precision, and Ilara had spent enough time with it that she could convey it clearly to people who were genuinely trying to understand. The hardest part was teaching the patience. Everyone who came to learn wanted to understand the process. The spore paste, the ventilation channels, the cultivation timeline. They wanted the steps, and the steps were there, and she gave them the steps, and the steps were necessary. But the steps were not sufficient. What was sufficient was the willingness to tend something for weeks without visible results. To trust that what you had put into the wood was working even when you could not see it working. To resist the urgency of a mind trained on visible progress. Some of her students had it naturally. Birch had it in abundance. He would sit beside a tree for an hour watching it with the focused, non-anxious attention of someone who had learned that most important things reveal themselves on their own timeline. Everett from the general store was harder to teach. He kept wanting to check the progress. She told him the same thing 3 times before it took. You will know it is working when the temperature changes, not before. There is no other evidence to look for. He came to her one morning, 3 weeks into the cultivation of the second tree, with an expression she recognized. He had put his hand on the bark and felt it. "It's working," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood there for a moment, hands still on the bark. The look on his face was the same look she had worn that first afternoon at the base of the ironwood, when she had pressed her palm against the ancient wood and felt the impossible warmth reach through it. She understood then that this was also part of what she was passing on, not just the technique, the experience of discovering that the world contains more than you were told, the specific, irreplaceable shock of placing your hand against something the world has been insisting is cold and finding it warm. Callum sat in on every session. He already knew most of it from weeks of watching her work, but he sat and listened anyway and occasionally added details she had not thought to mention. He had also, on his own initiative, borrowed Alcott's copy of a basic legal text and begun working through it on his slate with the focused determination of someone who has decided what they are going to be. She noticed this and said nothing. She was learning, with Callum, that the most useful thing she could do was stay close and not interfere. The map led them to the second tree in late spring, and the third in early summer. And by the time the leaves were full and the forest was loud with birds, they had identified and begun preparing 5 of the 14. Each one was different. Each one had its own character, its own particular conditions, its own set of things Alara had to learn before she could understand how to encourage the mycena to bloom there. The second tree was older even than the ironwood, its hollow already enormous, its bark so thick you could press your hand flat against it and feel nothing beneath your palm. It took 6 weeks of cultivation before the first trace of bioluminescence appeared in its walls, and when it did, it bloomed differently. Not the blue-green of the ironwood, but something closer to silver, pulsing at a slower rate, holding a temperature that was lower but somehow more even, more bone-deep. The third tree surprised her entirely. It was younger, narrower, and she had almost passed it by. The lichen indicator was faint, barely visible, and she had only noticed it because Birch had stopped walking and pointed at the bark without speaking. He had been right. The hollow inside was smaller, but the mycena growth was already vigorous, requiring much less cultivation than either of the first 2. She stood inside it with her hand on the wall and felt the warmth and thought, "My father walked here. He stood exactly here and felt exactly this." This happened every time. Every new tree brought the thought. Her father, walking the same routes she was now walking, taking the same careful notes, mapping the same network that her grandmother had told him about. He had known, as she now knew, that 14 trees was enough to shelter an entire region through any winter the sky could produce. He had tried to give it away. He had been stopped. But the network had waited, patient as wood, patient as fungus, patient as everything in the forest that operates on timelines longer than human plans. Now it was being given away. Properly, this time, without any single person deciding who deserved to know. Soren built the shelter over the teaching area without being asked, and this was so entirely in character that Alara did not comment on it. This was how he had been from the beginning. Present, practical, anticipating needs without requiring anyone to articulate them. She had spent enough time watching him work to understand that this was not silence born of shyness, but of something far more deliberate. He talked when he had something to say. He acted when something needed doing. The gap between those 2 moments was simply filled with work. The lean-to he built was better than it needed to be. The thatch was laid in overlapping rows with an angle that shed water cleanly. The uprights were anchored properly, not just stuck in the ground. He had chosen his wood with the eye of someone who understands that not all wood is equivalent, who knows which trees produce timber that will hold its shape through wet springs and dry summers and wet springs again. Callum watched him work one morning and said, in the observational tone he used for things he was filing away for future reference, "He does everything like he's building something that has to last." "Yes," Ilara said. "Like you," Callum said, and went back to his legal text. She stood with that for a moment. Then she went back to the journal. One afternoon, in the long golden days of late summer, Soren came to the hollow at the end of the working day and stood in the entrance with something in his hand. He had the look of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is reviewing it one final time. He held out a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind that grew along the stream bank, white-petaled and fine-stemmed, the sort of thing that grew without cultivation and did not try to be anything more than what it was. He did not say anything. Ilara looked at the flowers. She looked at his face, that broad, weathered, honest face that had been a steady presence since the early weeks of the hollow, when he had adjusted her axe grip and walked away without waiting to be thanked. She had known this was coming in the particular way that you know weather, not because anyone told you, but because you had learned to read the signs. She stepped forward and took the flowers from his hand. From somewhere in the trees behind them, Callum's voice drifted through the afternoon air. "Finally." The years settled into the landscape the way good things do, not announcing themselves, simply becoming part of what was true. The 14 trees were completed in stages, over several winters. Each one required its own preparation, its own patient cultivation, its own particular reading of the specific conditions inside that specific hollow. No two were identical. The mycena bloomed differently in each one, different intensities of light, different temperature profiles, different rates of establishment. She documented all of it in a continuation of her grandmother's journal, filling the blank pages at the back, and then a second volume, and then a third. The knowledge spread beyond Coldwater Ridge to the settlements nearby, carried outward by the people she had taught, who taught others in turn. There was nothing formal about it. No institution, no title, no authority granted by any council or legal body. Just people who understood something and showed it to other people who needed to understand it, the way knowledge has always traveled when it is working properly. Callum grew. He read every legal text Alcott could find for him and wrote Alcott long letters asking questions about the ones he had finished. He had a gift for it, not the performance of law, which some people confuse for the substance of it, but the underlying logic, the way a well-made argument fits together the way a well-made joint fits together in a piece of joinery. Alcott, in one of his letters back, called it a structural mind. Callum considered this for a while and decided it was a compliment. When he was old enough, he studied properly, and when he had finished studying, he came back and built a practice around the cases nobody else wanted. The women who had been told their land was not theirs. The children who had been told their inheritance had been lost. The people who had documents that should have meant something and had been told that they didn't. He was, by all accounts, very good at it. Eli, Harlan's youngest, the boy who had breathed so badly on the night of the storm, and whose fever had eased in the warmth of the hollow, grew up with a different inheritance than his father had intended. He became a student of the natural world, specifically of the relationships between organisms, the way things lived in systems rather than in isolation. He cited in his later written work The journals of a woman whose name most of the formal institutions of his era had not heard of, but whose observations he found to be precise, rigorous, and decades ahead of their time. He called her the first field naturalist of the old growth, and he meant it without qualification. Copper lived to an age that seemed, given his condition when Callum had found him at the dump, genuinely improbable. He slowed gradually, his gait first, then his hearing, then the amber sharpness of his eyes, and he went through each diminishment with the same equanimity he had brought to everything else. He did not suffer, so far as any of them could tell. He simply wound down, the way a good fire winds down when the wood has been fully spent, with nothing wasted and nothing remaining to burn. He died on an autumn afternoon, lying in his usual spot near the entrance of the hollow, in the blue-green light of the Mycena bloom. His head was in Callum's lap. His tail moved once. They buried him at the base of the great ironwood, in the curved space between two roots, in the earth that had been warm for years. The stone they placed there was small and flat, and what they carved into it was simple. He kept watch so she could sleep. He stayed until everyone was warm. Callum sat beside it for a long time after the burial. He did not say anything. He put his hand flat on the warm earth over the grave, and he sat there until the light failed, and then he went inside. Many years later, on an autumn afternoon when the aspens were doing what aspens do, burning gold this time, a good, honest gold, a girl sat in the entrance of the ironwood hollow and looked at her grandmother's face. She was 7 years old. She had her great-great-grandmother's eyes, or so people said, watchful eyes, patient. "Were you scared?" she asked. Ilara, old now, her hair entirely silver, her hands marked by decades of the kind of work that leaves permanent evidence, looked at the child for a moment. She thought about an honest answer. "Every single night," she said. The girl considered this, "But you stayed anyway." "The tree was never scared," Ilara said. "So I held on to the tree." The girl looked at the interior of the hollow, at the walls, where the Mycena bloom still pulsed its slow blue-green light, generation after generation of the same patient organism doing the same patient work, at the pegs on the wall where things had once hung, at the flat-topped stone that had been a table. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Ilara reached out and put her hand over her granddaughter's hand, small and warm, the hands of someone whose whole life was in front of her and who had, Ilara believed entirely, every capacity she would need for it. "Yes," she said, "we start with the roots." The ironwood stands still. The Mycena blooms in its walls with the same patient light it has always made, slow and blue-green and warm, the color of something that has decided to keep going regardless of what happens outside. The other 13 trees stand in the old forest, each one prepared, each one waiting, each one warm from the inside in a winter that does not end. In the evenings, in the settlements across the region, people still tell the story. They tell it the way the best stories are told, not as history, not as record, but as a thing that happened and keeps happening, that is true in the way that only the things which matter are true. They tell it to their children in the cold months, when the wind is high and the fire is low and the darkness outside has weight. They say, "There was a woman who did not fight the winter. She asked it for shelter instead. She built her home inside a living tree, and she kept the door open, and the people who came to her cold came out warm, and the knowledge she carried went forward into the world, and forward again, the way knowledge does when it is given freely and received with care. The earth never lies, they say, and neither did she.